that all men are created equal.
Black Man Thinkin.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
Black Man Thinkin.
Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Black Man Thinkin.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Black Man Thinkin.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Black Man Thinkin.
Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin, here on the vanguard of personal freedom, personal liberty, and personal responsibility, Mojo 50 Radio. Also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia. WJHC, Talk 107.5 North Florida Talk Radio. FreedomInAmericaRadio.com and WLBB News Talk AM 1330 and FM 106.3 in Carrollton, Georgia. Let's get to work. Mexico has replaced the House of Representatives. What am I talking about? Some of you may remember back on the 15th of February, this announcement by the President of the United States.
So I'm going to be signing a national emergency. And it's been signed many times before. It's been signed by other presidents. From 1977 or so, it gave the presidents the power. There's rarely been a problem. They signed it. Nobody cares. I guess they weren't very exciting. But nobody cares. They signed it for far less important things in some cases, in many cases. We're talking about an invasion of our country with drugs, with human traffickers, with all types of criminals and gangs.
Mr. President, what do you say to those, including some of your Republican allies, who say that you are violating the Constitution with this move and setting a bad precedent that will be abused by possibly Democratic presidents in the future? Marco Rubio.
Well, not too many people, Not too many people have said that. But the courts will determine that. Look, I expect to be sued. I shouldn't be sued. Very rarely do you get sued when you do national emergency. And then other people say, oh, if you use it for this, now what are we using it for? We've got to get rid of drugs and gangs and people. It's an invasion. We have an invasion of drugs and criminals coming into our country that we stop, but it's very hard to stop. With a wall, it would be very easy. So I think that we will be very successful in court. I think it's clear. And the people that say we create precedent, well, what do you have, 56 or a lot of times? Well, that's creating precedent. And many of those are far less important than having a border. You don't have a border, you don't have a country. You know, we fight, before I got here, we fight all over the world to create borders for countries. But we don't create a border for our own country. So I think what will happen is, sadly, we'll be sued, and sadly, it'll go through a process, and happily we'll win, I think.
Will you concede that you were unable to make the deal that you had promised in the past, and that the deal you're ending up with now from Congress is less than what you could have had before a 35-day shutdown? I
went through Congress. I made a deal. I got almost $1.4 billion when I wasn't supposed to get $1. Not $1. He's not going to get $1. Well, I got $1.4 billion, but I'm not happy with it. I also got billions and billions of dollars for other things. Port of entries, lots of different things. The purchase of drug equipment. More than we were even requesting. In fact, the primary fight was on the wall. Everything else, we have so much, as I said, I don't know what to do with it. We have so much money. But on the wall, they skimped. So I did. I was successful in that sense, but I want to do it faster. I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster. And I don't have to do it for the election. I've already done a lot of wall for the election, 2020. And the only reason we're up here talking about this is because of the election. Because they want to try and win an election, which it looks like they're not going to be able to do. And this is one of the ways they think they can possibly win, is by obstruction.
Let's take that in kind of reverse order. The only reason the Democrats are fighting on the wall is because of the election they lost in 2016, the one that they don't really, at this point, have a legitimate or reasonable path toward winning in 2020. And if Donald Trump can actually get a wall built along the border of Mexico, and as I said, a lot of it's already been built, then they most certainly lessen their chances for victory. Let's also go back to what he said. Notice how they're gaming him. They're trying to game him. He asked for $5 billion, they gave him $1.4 billion, but they publicly said they weren't going to give him anything. So the idea is we give him a little bit something, after we promise him nothing, he won't say anything, and he will cede us the political point that we did not give him what he wanted for the wall. And Donald Trump chose not to play that game. The other one was he talked about the precedent for presidents to declare national emergency. National emergencies have been declared by presidents since the 19-teens. Woodrow Wilson declared national emergencies. The difference between what Woodrow Wilson did and what was done up until 1977 was the Congress had no recourse when the executive exercised that power. They could simply say, you know what, I don't like what you did, I'm going to do something different, and all Congress could do was nothing. 1976, they passed a law that gave Congress the opportunity to try to talk the president out of it, and they weren't able to do that. They could vote on a resolution to rescind the national emergency. Of course, the executive didn't give up all of its power. It said, fine, I have to sign it. So if he doesn't sign it, then you need a veto-proof majority because you have to override his veto. That's what's been in place since 1977. So Donald Trump knows what's going on. You guys are trying to relitigate 2016 and try to give yourself an issue for 2020. And it's all about the wall. You want to fund it, you just don't want it. Okay. So Nancy Pelosi the day before came out and called what the president was declaring illusory.
The president just said that he will declare a national emergency when he signs this bill. Do you still plan to file a legal challenge if and when he does that, and how quickly would you do that?
Did I ever say I was filing a legal challenge?
You said Democrats
I
would
may.
challenge.
That's an option, and we'll review our options. But it's important to note that when the president declares this emergency, first of all, it's not an emergency, what's happening at the border. It's a humanitarian challenge to us. The president has tried to sell a bill of goods to America. But putting that aside, just in terms of the president making an end run around Congress, here he said, let us respect what the committee will do, and then walks away from it. We will review our options. We'll be prepared to respond appropriately to it. I know the Republicans have some unease about it, no matter what they say, because if the president can declare an emergency on something that he has created as an emergency, an illusion that he wants to convey, just think of what a president with different values can present to the American people. You want to talk about a national emergency? Let's talk about today, the one-year anniversary of another manifestation of the epidemic of gun violence in America. That's a national emergency. Why don't you declare that emergency, Mr. President? I wish you would.
So national emergency. Nancy Pelosi believes that Donald Trump is creating this illusion of a national emergency, and then she turns around to the illusion of an epidemic of gun violence. You do realize that cars kill more people than guns. Hammers sometimes kill more people than guns. A whole lot of things kill more people than guns, but only guns represent the people's right to repel or resist the government. And most of the gun deaths in this country are suicides. What about the mass shootings? What about them? They're terrible, yes. they also don't kill that many people, and they haven't killed that many people. They didn't even start to kill that many people until Barack Obama was president. And therefore, you would punish never mind. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. So on the 22nd of February, a week after Donald Trump declared the emergency, 4 Democrats from the House went down to San Ysidro and decided to see for themselves whether or not there was any type of crisis or emergency at the border.
And 4 congressmen, including the majority leader, toured the San Ysidro port of entry this afternoon. It's the busiest land port of entry in the Western Hemisphere, and they wanted to see what's working and what's not. And that's where we find 10 News reporter Rena Nakano. Rena, the Democratic lawmakers still maintain there's no crisis at the border.
Yeah, actually, they told me that the president's national declaration of emergency is a manufactured political move. In fact, they told me that San Ysidro here is getting a lot of things right. 4 congressmen, including House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer of Maryland, addressing the press after an all-access tour of the San Ysidro land port of entry.
There is no crisis at the border.
A contradiction to the president's reasoning to build a southern border wall. It's been almost 1 month since Homeland Security began implementing the new Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, which states that caravan migrants entering the U.S. without papers or those claiming asylum must wait in Mexico for the duration of their immigration proceedings, a policy Congressman Juan Vargas strongly rejects.
And to be sent back to a place like Tijuana where they don't have family, they don't have friends, I think it's the wrong thing to do. It's not our American values.
Previous to MPP, migrants were released into the U.S. after their initial process, under the assumption they would return to U.S. Immigration Court at a later time to receive their final status. But DHS says too many of them skip court and disappear into the U.S. as fugitives. Majority Leader Hoyer using the president's coined slogan to refute that claim.
That's fake news. 97% of people show up. That's a better percentage than show up who are on parole in the United States of America for crimes.
After touring the facility, these Democrats agreed. Solving the immigration issue is not as simple as building a wall. Overcrowding the port with seemingly endless asylum seekers isn't the answer either. They were all impressed by the work being done here, and they hope all other ports implement the high-tech protocols conducted at San Ysidro.
We need to invest in the technology of the future, just as we've done here at San Ysidro and all 330 ports of entry.
Yeah, and the Democrats added that getting federal funding for things like capital investments, technology, and also training for personnel at ports like San Ysidro would serve a much better purpose than a physical wall at our southern border. Reporting live tonight at San Ysidro, I'm Rena Nakano, 10 News.
Rena, thank you.
So the Democrats go out on a field trip so they can draw press and say the president's lying. There's no real problem here, and you can't talk about people going into the country. They look at all these people. 90-something% of them show up for their hearings. That's correct. But did you realize that only 28% of asylum cases are approved? Those applications are more than 70% of the time turned down. But 100% of the people are released into the country. You don't see the problem with that, huh? Okay. Nevertheless, you had that going on, and then you had what happened on the 30th of May.
Now to an exclusive NBC News report. U.S. Border Patrol agents apprehended a group of more than 1,000 migrants who illegally crossed the southern border near El Paso, Texas. It's believed to be the largest single group intercepted by the Border Patrol. NBC News' Julia Ainsley has the exclusive details. Julia, what can you tell us about what's going on?
Well, you're right, Jeff. This is the largest group that Border Patrol has encountered, and the last record was over 400 set last month. They are seeing larger groups coming. It's part of a trend. Immigration advocates say that these immigrants feel safety in numbers. They want to come in a large group because of how dangerous it can be to cross through these areas. More immigrants are coming in illegally. Some of the advocates say that's because it is harder to come in legally. It's taking longer to get in when you want to claim asylum at legal ports of entry. But what this means from a safety and humanitarian perspective perspective is sometimes Border Patrol is not able to safely attend to these large groups. They don't have the medical personnel. Often these people are only patrolling the border in pairs. So you have 2 border agents encountering a group of over 1,000 in this case. And we know the majority of them, over 900, traveled as part of a family. That means if you encounter a mother and child, those would count as 2 family units. That's the way they count this. So we're seeing more families, again, part of a growing trend, as families come here to claim asylum, fleeing violence and poverty in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America.
Hey, Julia, the president mentioned a big immigration announcement coming today when he left the White House this morning. Do we know whether this is the announcement that he was talking about?
I'm told, Jeff, from a well-placed source, that this will be a large thrust of that announcement, that the president wants to show that there's a crisis at the border, to try to paint the picture of an invasion, and that this piece of information is something that he's been holding in order to make this a very dramatic rollout tomorrow. But, if that's the case, it's important to keep in mind that these are not people who come in armed or dangerous. Nothing in our information or their documents that we've seen indicate that they pose any kind of threat to the border agents, but just that their sheer numbers do present problems not only just for border agents but for themselves, and that they can be safely attended to. But yes, I think we should keep our ears out for the same number, 1,036, tomorrow when the president speaks.
NBC's Julia Ainsley with that exclusive reporting. Julia, thank you.
Well, if there's no crisis, if there's no humanitarian, no security, this, that, and the other crisis, what do you call 1,000 people coming across the border where there might be only 2 Border Patrol agents? Does that sound like a secure border? Does that sound like a well-managed humanitarian situation? It doesn't to me. Now, Donald Trump had gotten his fill of dealing with Congress on this. Congress, particularly the Democrats, were not interested in protecting the American people from illegal immigration. So Donald Trump took another path, which is exactly what you expect high-level executives to do. Not high-level politicians, but you expect high-level executives to do. If I can't work with you, let me find somebody I can work with. And Donald Trump went after Mexico.
There is now a statement from the White House. In fact, it's a statement from the president himself, a paper statement, that says he's going to impose new tariffs on all goods coming in from Mexico. He says they'll increase until the illegal immigration problem is resolved. And so, first of all, your thoughts on this. How is this going to affect this USMCA trade deal? And what are your thoughts about the use of tariffs here as this kind of retaliatory measure to try to force something to get done on immigration?
3 quick points. First and foremost, USMCA or NAFTA 2.0 is by no means a done deal. Democrats are divided on this in the House of Representatives as to whether or not it can be ratified. Vice President Mike Pence was in Ottawa earlier on Thursday meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and he all but guaranteed that USMCA would be ratified. But again, the politics in the House of Representatives are very divided. Secondly, the president's going to run into the business community here, in particular a key constituency of his manufacturers. They do not like tariffs, particularly tariffs impacting Mexico. I mean, that trade, like hundreds of millions of dollars worth daily crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, it really directly impacts manufacturers. And thirdly, this is really the most aggressive step that we've seen coming from this White House in tying tariffs with immigration. And as you mentioned, this definitely impacts the USMCA forecast, which is something that the president would like to get ratified heading into 2020, but as of now is incredibly uncertain future.
So what was Mexico's response to being put on the spot with either fix this problem or you're going to get tariffs, you're going to get an economic impact? Well, ABC News reported on, I believe it was the 11th, looking at the article, the 9th of July, migrant crossings at U.S. border plummet as Mexico, not the United States, Mexico cracks down. The number of undocumented migrants being stopped at the U.S.-Mexico border has dropped dramatically in just weeks, remaining at high levels, but also representing the first decline in several months. The drop follows an agreement by the Mexican government with President Trump to deploy its own security forces to crack down on asylum seekers. What was that result? A 28% drop from May until now. May, the month where you saw those people crossing the border. Wow. Oh, by the way, they actually are stationing their National Guard troops on their southern border with Guatemala, and they are inspecting buses, trains, other forms of conveyances, even going into hotels to find people who are undocumented, and they are deporting them out of Mexico before they can sniff the U.S. border. So Mexico is putting time, money, and effort into supporting U.S. immigration law. Time in renegotiating NAFTA, that will reduce migrant incentives. Money, they're posting their own military to check folks entering Mexico. And effort raiding Mexican hotels, buses, trains, using cops and troops to keep migrants from getting north. And Mexico is dropping all that coin and making these entries, the number of entries, fall off a cliff, even though they're still high. So imagine what would happen if the U.S. Congress, the elected American Democrats, did as much to cooperate with the American president as Mexico has. I wonder how many fewer illegal entries there would be. Maybe. Now, or perhaps they may have stopped the border emergency that they deny there's no emergency, that from becoming the crisis that they now acknowledge. This is fascinating to me. Mediaite comes up with a CNN poll, their latest poll. The percent of Democrats who say there's a crisis at the border is up 47 points since January. So it wasn't a crisis in January, it's a crisis now, but in February the Democrats were still in denial. Now they're on board. Really? Maybe if you cooperate with the president, we wouldn't have this problem. But back to the Mexico angle. How are Mexico's actions and efforts, which indeed are reducing illegal immigration, which is the same thing a wall would do, how is what they're doing anything other than a variation on the theme, Mexico will pay for the wall? Whether they cut a check for construction or they appropriate Mexican funds to have their law enforcement and military keep folks from crossing our border, if Mexico is spending money and that results in fewer illegal entries into the United States, somebody's paying for that drop. And whether it's a wall or whether it's people interdicting, as long as it's Mexico's money and there's a reduction, they're paying. I'm sorry, they're paying. And as a result, Mexico has replaced the House of Representatives because they're doing the House's job. The House of Representatives is supposed to be deploying, appropriating money in a way that ensures the integrity of the U.S. border. They won't do that. They refuse to do that. And where they have failed to act, Mexico has stepped in and shown how a little bit of effort can make a significant difference. It doesn't take that much, guys. But you have to remember, for the Democrats, they're spending money on everything but this. That's what the president said at the outset. Why? Because they want an issue at the election. Here's the problem. The issue creates more angel moms in this country, mothers and fathers of people who were killed by criminal illegal immigrants. Why? Because you keep letting these people in, which includes the gang members, which includes the human traffickers, which includes the drug merchants. You're not checking any of it, but now Mexico is. At this point, I'm a much bigger fan of the Mexican government than I am of House Democrats when it comes to maintaining U.S. sovereignty. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin', we'll be back right after this.
Black Man Thinkin.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
Black Man Thinkin.
Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Black Man Thinkin.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Black Man Thinkin.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Black Man Thinkin.
Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin, here on the vanguard of personal freedom, personal liberty, and personal responsibility, Mojo 50 Radio. Also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia. WJHC, Talk 107.5 North Florida Talk Radio. FreedomInAmericaRadio.com and WLBB News Talk, AM 1330 and FM 106.3 in Carrollton, Georgia. I think it's about time that we make a habit of saying it out loud that Democrats are the anti-Americans. And I know how people want to see, and I'm at my end of patience. I'll be honest. I'm at the end of my patience with people who keep trying to say that everyone who has American citizenship is actually interested in the well-being of America. We give out citizenship too easily. To be honest, the immigrants who come through the legal process and are naturalized in many ways are better educated, more fiercely loyal citizens who have a higher allegiance to the United States, to its Constitution, and simply have a greater knowledge of the history of the country and what it even stands for. Democrats, on the other hand, normally don't fall into that category. They don't know the history of the United States. They know a revisionist history of the United States. Democrats tend to ignore the fact that they are the party of slavery. They tend to ignore the fact that even then, back in the 1960s when civil rights was going on, we know why Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted the civil rights legislation. Because we know that he was a racist from the time he entered Congress, and then all of a sudden he becomes this magnanimous individual as president. No, he said he knew how to make sure he had those Negroes, and he didn't use that word Negroes necessarily, to keep them voting Democratic for 200 years. We got to give them a little something. I believe his words, as quoted by I don't want to say it's a biographer, but definitely a writer on what happened during his administration. This was aboard Air Force One, spoken to two governors. You know, these Negroes, they're getting uppity. And that's a problem for us because they have something now that they didn't have before to go with their uppityness. And that's political power. We've got to do something about this. We got to give them a little something. Enough to make them quiet, but not enough to make a difference. People keep forgetting that the civil rights movement did its greatest amount of change on the social fabric of the United States when black people in the Deep South didn't really have unrestricted voting rights. Nobody cast a vote with regard to the Montgomery bus boycott. Nobody went in and said, we're going to go in here and just mount us a political campaign, get something on the ballot, and then vote for it, and then we're going to change these laws about where you can sit on the bus. It didn't work that way. But you had that action, and you had other actions. And now we have forgotten what the power came from. The power didn't come from the vote. The power came from moral suasion and moral force of will. We knew, as black people at that time, we knew that our cause was right, and we were going to stand for that purpose and stand on those principles no matter what happened. But I digress. Now we allowed Lyndon Baines Johnson to throw a program at us that was supposed to keep us voting Democrat for the next 200 years. We're only 50 or so years into it. And based on the voting patterns of black Americans, he's right on track, particularly with black females. They may not ever vote for anything other than a Democrat. It's their choice. It's their right. But they're hurting themselves. When I say that the Democrats are anti-American, especially today, let's remember who they ran for president in 2016. This is a woman who had to steal and cheat and misdirect in order to get the nomination so that she would not lose to someone else who was not even a Democrat. She was about to lose the Democrat Party nomination for president to a man old as the hills who was not even a Democrat, to a socialist, an admitted socialist, by the way. They were going to nominate someone who had called and for all we know still considered at least certain blacks super predators who needed to be brought to heel. It was her husband who signed and during her campaign defended the signing of the 1994 crime bill. Now, full disclosure, I never had a problem with the crime bill. Let me tell you why. Because the people that it went after were committing crimes against black people. The people that it sought to punish committed 90% of their crimes and more against black people. Of course, I have no problem with them getting thrown under the jail. Well, what about white folks? You know what? What folks are doing to people who are not in my community, I really don't give a rat's behind about that. I don't. And I'm still trying to get back to talking about the problem with Democrats today. Well, let's do it this way. Seems with every opportunity we have with the current Congress, who I will go to my grave based on what I was able to research and read, their House majority is illegitimate. There was more voter and election fraud going on in 2018 than you can shake a stick at. Florida, in Broward County alone, the good witch doctor Brenda Snipes, she was just prolific in her ability to manufacture votes after the polls had closed. But they have this majority now. Illegitimate as it may be, it's still a majority. But they use that majority not to further any American interests, but they would rather compromise U.S. sovereignty. They would abandon traditional U.S. protection protocols that go through the legislative branch of government. They would reinterpret the Constitution and just generally throw the American people under the bus. They don't have any problem with that at all. And the interesting thing is they did all this time in one bill that was supposed to fund the military. Representative Dan Crenshaw, a combat veteran turned congressman, went to explain a recent piece of legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act, that is annual legislation that funds the U.S. military. And he wanted to talk about this year's version, and he gives a very good explanation of what it is for 2019 and why at least certain elements of it should be opposed.
Hello, and welcome to the next Here's the Truth video. This one is going to be on the NDAA, that is the National Defense Authorization Act. So I should probably first explain what exactly that is. That is an enormous piece of legislation. It gets passed every single year. It is the piece of legislation that actually authorizes the Department of Defense. It's what authorizes our military. It tells the military what it can and can't do. It's actually usually pretty bipartisan. A lot of legislators like working on it because they know that it's something that will get passed and will get worked on in a bipartisan fashion. But unfortunately, like a lot of things in 2019, that's not happening this year. And I'm going to explain why and what's in this that Republicans have a lot of problems with. There's 4 sections in particular that are highly politicized. They're all about, you guessed it, the border. Okay, so I'm going to explain really briefly what each of those 4 sections are. The first one is an attempt to prevent the president from reprogramming some money for military construction and using it to build a border wall. The problem here is that in doing so, there are second and third order effects. When I talk to military leaders about this, they're very concerned about this because it's not specific. It's actually very overarching. So if you do this, if you do what the Democrats are saying, the military now can't reprogram any money for military reconstruction. This will affect future administrations as well, and it severely inhibits our military leaders from actually flexibly moving money around the way they need to and the way they're highly accustomed to. This is a very normal practice. The second thing it does is it requires the Secretary of Defense to provide 30 days notice anytime they want to use U.S. troops at the southern border. This is totally arbitrary, and it prevents any kind of timely response to emergencies that might occur at our southern border. I don't think Americans should be in favor of this at all. The other interesting section we have here is that it actually prohibits the use of the Department of Defense to construct, replace, or modify any wall or physical barrier. That's slightly different than the first thing I mentioned. This one is interesting because this particular issue, this was actually signed into law by President Obama, where in 2016 they authorized the Secretary of Defense to support the construction of roads and fences and installation of lighting to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries. Remember, this was just under the Obama administration. And why would they do this? Well, because it makes sense. It makes sense for the Department of Defense to support DHS in these missions, especially when it comes to counter drug operations. Now, the NDAA would prohibit this. That's not good policy. The last thing that this does, which we don't like, is it makes it very difficult for the Department of Defense to actually support DHS with personnel. They would have to go through an extensive amount of notification processes just to provide DHS or our Border Patrol with personnel like linguists, intelligence analysts, transportation of personnel, supplies, equipment, really just basic stuff. And again, this is a practice that has been ongoing for a long time. Our government works together. The DOD works together with the DEA, works together with DHS and CBP. I'm sorry, that's a lot of acronyms, but that's what they do. It's a whole-of-government approach to defense. Remember, this is the Department of Defense in the end, and oftentimes we do need to defend against threats even at our southern border. It's not just immigration that we're talking about. Those are all wildly, I think, problematic provisions within the NDAA, and they're highly politicized and unnecessary. But that's not all. The last reason that we're concerned about this NDAA is because of what it does, or more importantly, what it doesn't do for our nuclear capabilities. Our nuclear capabilities have been aging for a very, very long time. Our triad has been aging for a long time. The triad means 3 things: ground-based systems, missiles that are able to be launched from missile silos within the United States, our water-based systems, which means submarines, and our air-based systems, which means the future will mean B-21 bombers. You need to modernize all of these things. Why? Well, we're transitioning from a period where We've been really focused on terrorist organizations, non-state actors. We're transitioning back to a world where we have near-peer competitors, Russia and China specifically. We have to modernize our own capabilities. We can't limit our research and development into this because China and Russia are definitely doing so. And it's not just nuclear, it's hypersonic, it's 5G networks, so that we can get the right technology and research and development done so that we can actually push out Chinese companies like Huawei, which are a threat to our national security. That's why we're against this particular NDAA. Now, the Senate has passed a good NDAA. We're voting against this today so that when it goes to conference, when those bills from the House and the Senate go to conference, well, there's a message sent there that we need to fix these provisions. And I think they will get fixed. I'm hopeful that they will. And I'm going to continue to be hopeful that pieces of legislation that are usually bipartisan will hopefully get back to being bipartisan. That's today's Here's the Truth.
Again, that was Representative Dan Crenshaw, Republican of Texas, explaining the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act and the problems or the challenges that he saw with it and that Republicans saw with it. Let me just go ahead and recap some of that. No reprogramming by the military. I was in military acquisition, and that's kind of what happened every year. Congress would make a vote. We'd go through the year. Certain things would happen. Some programs would do well. Others would stall. You would want to move different amounts of money from one pile to another, particularly in R&D, because R&D was very volatile as far as what success you would have and what you would not. Sometimes you would have to do the same thing with military construction. You need to move money around. And now this is basically telling military personnel, military leaders, no, you can't change the money around. Okay. A 30-day notice before deploying troops. So if Americans are under attack someplace and we want to send troops in, we have to tell Congress 30 days before we send them in, even if the attack is ongoing. 30-day notice. Think about that. It's ridiculous. Then they actually, to let you know what they're really about, they go against things they voted for under the Obama administration that had the military able to support DHS with respect to construction activities that would disrupt the movement of drugs into the country, that would provide other support to DHS, linguists, definitely not military support, but just personnel that would help. All this, of course, was in defense of the nation. And they even voted that down. See, this is what I mean. Their idea of going after Trump is not just going after Trump. They are out to, in this case, wipe out certain parts of the Constitution. It's just strange. Until you finally get your head around the fact that Democrats aren't looking for a better America, they're simply looking for another America. They don't want America, an America with the Constitution we have. They want a modified First Amendment in the Constitution, one that says that God has no place in the public square, kind of like we have in France, where they threw God out at pretty much the beginning of the 20th century. They've had their butt invaded 2 times since, and they're undergoing a slow motion invasion right now with Muslims taking over the country and wreaking havoc on them. They don't want that. They want to weaken what we can have done at the border. We talked about that in the last segment, where Mexico is basically doing their job for them. So they want to compromise U.S. sovereignty on both sides of the border. They don't want to do they don't want to do their job, and they want to keep the military from taking up any of the slack from they're not doing their job. The only thing we have going for us is they cannot dictate to Mexico what Mexico does with its own money, and they are choosing to take actions which support U.S. immigration law and sovereignty. Now, you'll notice that the House, and the New York Times actually wrote an article on this, and I use that not because I trust the New York Times, I do not. But even they put it out how bad this was. They wrote the House gave final approval on Friday to a defense bill that would put a liberal stamp on military policy by shackling President Trump's ability to wage war in Iran. He doesn't want to wage war in Iran. He wants Iran to know that he can wage war so that they do not continue their foolishness in the Straits of Hormuz. You want to shackle him from doing that? So what are you going to do to Iran? Nothing? Well, that's what they have done, because the Democrat policy toward Iran is to negotiate with pallets of cash. Just drop pallets of money on them, and hopefully they'll do something akin to what you would like. Doesn't work. Never has, never will work. A $733 billion National Defense Authorization Act passed along stark party lines, 220 to 197, with no Republicans voting for the legislation. And this is unusual, as the congressman pointed out. Traditionally, everybody gets together. This is one of the things that you can get done across party lines during a year. No, not anymore. Not with this House. Not with this Nancy Pelosi led House. Not with Ilhan Omar. Not with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Not with Presley of Massachusetts. No, you can't do that with these witches. The only thing that's keeping this is they know that it's not getting past the Senate, and they know it's not going to make it past the president. They know this. But they're also willing to hold the military hostage and therefore hold national defense hostage as they try to basically strip the executive branch of its power by lessening the executive's control of the military. Remember, the executive branch is the one that commands the military. I hope no one's forgotten that. I really do. So what they're doing is, instead of seeking bipartisan cooperation to equip the military and fund policies that let whatever adversaries we have know they will be held to account, they want to see national defense through a wholly progressive lens. The problem is progressivism has not, does not, nor could it ever defend the American people or their homeland. Now, they also seek to legislate. You see what they did, as though the U.S. Constitution's Article 2 has been magically expunged. You know, there's no presidential power. There's only our power. We have the power of the purse. That's the only power that is. They actually think that they've been given the power, or want to act as though they've been given the power that the founders gave to the executive branch. And with these actions, Democrats seek to leave the American people unable to defend their land from unarmed invasion, which is what's happening at the southern border, to deprive them of the leadership of their duly elected officials, in this case the president. Because if they ever got this passed in its current form, the precedent's been set. Article 2 doesn't mean anything because we've trumped it with our ability to control the money. And I used the word Trump inappropriately, but. And now the other thing they want to do is try to, basically ham-handedly revise the document, the Constitution, that's responsible for maintaining the world's most successful republic for nearly 2.5 centuries. All to pursue their ideology and dogmas that have failed every time they've been tried, everywhere they've been tried, and by everyone who's tried them. And what they want you to believe is that we're just doing this because Trump's so bad. No. Donald Trump became president by promising the American people that he would do for them what they had asked to have done for decades, only to be ignored. But that was his first offense. His second and worse offense was to work to keep those promises, which included delivering more employment opportunities and a more vibrant economy for America and its workforce. 2, protecting Americans from illegal immigration. And 3, removing America from wars that she need not fight. We're out of the wars. We're not hearing as much about the wars because Donald Trump is not Barack Obama. Donald Trump is not droning people all over the place and then trying to defend the use of illegal drone attacks on foreign soil. Those items, the economy and jobs, illegal immigration, and getting out of endless wars, those have been items on the American people's agenda since at least the 2004 election. And now the American people have somebody who's trying to do something about what they want. But Democrats don't like Americans because we're too given to self-governance, to solving our own problems, to creating opportunities that governments can neither anticipate nor control. And control of the American people, of you, not Donald Trump, but of you, is what the Democrats want. Because there is no Trump resistance. They're trying to resist your will. Now, Maya Angelou said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. My question to all of you is this: how many more times need Democrats and progressives show you who and what they are before you believe them, and at least politically destroy them? I'm going to turn this over to my good friend Ron Edwards, and after that we'll be back with hour 2 of Black Man Thinking.
The collective nervous breakdown of the American left began experiencing election night 2016 remains untreated and continues to worsen. Hello, I'm Ron Edwards. On today's page from the Edwards Notebook, leftist Democrats and journalists collectively only support policies that put America at a disadvantage. I have never, ever heard or read about leftists giving a hoot about Americans murdered, raped, or robbed by illegal border crossers. But they howl to the heavens when U.S. border agents separate children from adults at the border in order to process them. Quite often, adults claiming to be bringing their children into our nation are using children they rented in order to fool U.S. customs officials, and for other purposes. Recently, a New York Times guest columnist advocated for doxing, exposing the names and addresses of Border Patrol agents because she, like Democrats, want the United States to be overrun by illegals and collapse economically in order to fundamentally transform our republic into a broken-down, ineffective, mob-rule democracy. My fellow Americans, the United States is worth fighting for, and with providential guidance, victory is ours. I'm Ron Edwards. Join me live Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific on AmericanMatters.us.
I have a dream. One day, this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Black Man Thinkin.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
Black Man Thinkin.
Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Black Man Thinkin.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Black Man Thinkin.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Black Man Thinkin.
Stanley Levy with Hour 2 of Black Man Thinkin here on the vanguard of personal freedom, personal liberty, and personal responsibility, Mojo 50 Radio. Also, WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia. WJHC, Talk 107.5 North Florida Talk Radio. Freedom in AmericaRadio.com and WLBB, News Talk, AM 1330 and FM 106.3 in Carrollton, Georgia. Well, Donald Trump keeps demonstrating the rhetoric that endears him to Middle America. And I want people to really understand what I'm saying here. Because what you get from the so-called moderates and the leftists is the idea that what Donald Trump is saying is inappropriate, it's unpresidential. No, it's American. Americans are a proud people. Americans don't take well to criticism, undue criticism, from folks who are nowhere near as accomplished as they are, especially if they are from less successful countries. And it's not because we feel we're better than them as people, but don't come to the U.S. and try to talk smack about the U.S. and expect not to get clapped back. It's going to come back on you. And Donald Trump does clap back better than almost anyone else in American politics. And the thing is, the left can't stand that because what they want is for the American electorate to be quiet. They don't want them to speak their minds. And they definitely don't want them to talk out loud about their values. And the problem they have is when Donald Trump does something that resonates with the American electorate and the American people. I mean, it really resonates. And then, of course, all the identity politics comes out. Oh, he's a misogynist, he's a racist. I say, he's no such thing. He's tired of you criticizing things just for some political advantage. What am I talking about now? Well, there are the four witches of the Democrat Party. That would be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that would be Ilhan Omar, that would be Rashida Tlaib, and that would be Ayanna Pressley. I call them the four witches of the Democrat Party. Like the four horses of the apocalypse, these are the four witches of the Democrat Party. These freshmen, I believe, congresswomen, very progressive, very liberal, very unintelligent, very loud, and wrong about everything. Let's remove Pressley from the discussion for the moment, simply because, by all accounts, she was born here in the United States. She's from the United States. You could make the argument you might want to remove Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the discussion for the same reason. But the truth of the matter is she is so clueless you cannot. Because she is glommed on to the cause of illegal immigrants to the point where she doesn't sound American at all. She just doesn't. But more to the point, what we have now is, and it's hilarious. The Daily Mail came out with a piece recently, July 11th, and it says, did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, just call Nancy Pelosi racist? Freshman Democrat accuses Speaker Pelosi of singling out newly elected women of color and saying she's outright disrespectful as their bitter feud over tweeting escalates. Think about this for a minute. Nancy Pelosi, well, first of all, she's old as dirt. Nancy Pelosi is not the brightest tool in this. She's not the sharpest tool in the drawer, but she is a cunning politician, and she's highly experienced. Did this child just come out here and try to talk about how she is how she is due respect with her dumb behind? The bartender is going to tell the Speaker of the House that she's outright disrespectful and singling out newly elected women of color. Oh my gosh. She's accused House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of repeatedly singling out newly elected women of color in a scathing interview, branding the veteran Congresswoman as being outright disrespectful. The remarks are sure to intensify the already strained relations between Pelosi and Ocasio-Cortez. Came just an hour after Ocasio-Cortez accused Congress of using women and minority groups as bargaining chips for lawmakers' own political gain. The outspoken Democrat and her three closest peers, the other three horsewomen, the other three witches, have been embroiled in a public rift with Pelosi ever since Congress passed a border funding bill. They couldn't get their way. They're still throwing their tantrum. But the feud turned nasty when Pelosi took aim at the squad once more in a closed-door caucus meeting. Here's what was reportedly said by Pelosi. You got a complaint, you come and talk to me about it. But do not tweet about our members and expect us to think that that is just okay. But outside, Ocasio-Cortez insisted she would defy Pelosi's call to stop the tweets and will not change her social media habits. You're not the boss of me. That chick is going to have a rough time in Washington if she stands between Pelosi and anything of importance, at least in the mind of Nancy Pelosi. So that's interesting. But she's trying to imply that she's a racist because she and her other three witches are not white. That's basically it. If you don't like us and you're white and we're not, the reason you don't like us has nothing to do with what we're doing, has everything to do with the fact that we're a different color and you're a racist. My gosh, are we still doing this? Obama's gone. Are we still doing this? Bush is gone. Are we still doing this? Clinton's gone. Are we still doing this? Well, this is too funny to me. Ben Shapiro on Daily Wire picked up on this on his radio show, and he just had himself a relative field day.
AOC is now calling Pelosi a racist, and that is just phenomenal because Pelosi deserves it. This is the new rule, as my business partner, Jeremy Boring, now verified on Twitter, points out. He points out that racism is basically the all-purpose term for I disagree with somebody to my left. So Donald Trump is a racist because he disagrees with Nancy Pelosi, and now Nancy Pelosi is a racist because she disagrees with AOC. Now, AOC told the New Yorker radio hour, quote, I think sometimes people think we have a relationship. Not particularly. Ooh, cutting. Oh, I love this stuff. This is so good. And then she suggested to the Washington Post that Pelosi was a racist. Quote, when these comments first started, I kind of thought she was keeping the progressive flank at more of an arm's distance in order to protect more moderate members, which I understood. But the persistent singling out, it got to the point where it was just outright disrespectful. The explicit singling out of a newly elected women of color. Boom! Drop the mic. She's played the woman of color card. Nancy Pelosi, down, start that count. Oh boy. So now AOC is suggesting that Nancy Pelosi doesn't like AOC because AOC is brown. That's the actual suggestion. That Nancy Pelosi, who's openly explaining why she's got a problem with AOC. Like she keeps telling AOC and these freshman members, stop talking about primarying our members. Stop tweeting about fellow Democrats. It's obnoxious. It's bad for us. It undercuts our legislative agenda. And AOC's like, you're just saying that because you hate me because you're a racist. Man, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats deserve every aspect of this. Every single grain of that identity politics cocaine they've been snorting for years. It's now coming back in the form of serious mental problems. And it is delicious and it is well deserved. Never get high off your own supply, says Cocaine Mitch. And that is exactly what happened here. The Democrats got high off their own supply. The identity politics was a weapon. It was supposed to be used against people on the right. And now, because it has infused every vein in the Democratic body politic, it's going to be used against anyone you disagree with, including Nancy Pelosi, who's sitting there going, what the hell? I shepherded Obamacare and ran Congress for this? For this pipsqueak to come and call me a racist because I think that she's incompetent? Yes. 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 So, the way that this has been working for Democrats for years now is that if you disagree with Democrats, you are a racist. Nancy Pelosi now disagrees with AOC, and that means that she is a racist, which I'm sure that's where this is going. Hilarious. Hilarious. So she posed on this cover of Rolling Stone with AOC and with Rashida Tlaib and with Ilhan Omar, and now that three-person caucus is turning on Nancy Pelosi and now categorizing her with whom? Tucker Carlson? That's the other person that Ilhan Omar is going after today. Ilhan Omar suggesting that Tucker Carlson is a racist because he said our immigration system is broken if it's bringing in people like Ilhan Omar who have such a negative view of the country. So I guess Nancy Pelosi is now part of the Tucker Carlson crew. Amazing how as the Overton window shifts left, Nancy Pelosi is going to end up being like the co-host of the show by the time the left is done. It's insane. It's totally crazy.
It is. And the interesting thing about this, for me, and this is something that I have real differences of opinion on with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is far too magnanimous a man. I already hear the people groaning out there. Donald Trump treats people who act like his enemies publicly and sometimes even privately as though they're anything but. You might remember his treatment of Mitt Romney, who came out and torched him during the 2016 campaign, only to come crawling back, hoping to get a job in the administration, which he did not. Donald Trump took him to dinner and sat down with him and did all that stuff. And the number of people who trashed Donald Trump and Donald Trump's reaction to them is like they never said a word against him. He actually came to Nancy Pelosi's defense regarding the, Wicked Witch of the North. I guess you could say she's the Wicked Witch of the North. Wicked Witch of the North, East, West, and South, but the one in the North would be AOC. He came to her defense about about them implying, or her implying, that Nancy Pelosi was racist.
Well, I think Cortez, who kept Amazon out of New York, and they don't like her for that, thousands and thousands of jobs. I think Cortez is being very disrespectful to somebody that's been there a long time. I deal with Nancy Pelosi a lot, and we go back and forth, and it's fine. But I think that a group of people is being very disrespectful to her. And you know what? I don't think that Nancy can let that go on. A group of people that came from, I don't know where they came from. I'm looking at this Omar from Minnesota. And if one half of the things they're saying about her are true, she shouldn't even be in office. But Cortez should treat Nancy Pelosi with respect. She should not be doing what she's doing. And I'll tell you something about Nancy Pelosi that you know better than I do. She is not a racist, okay? She is not a racist. For them to call her a racist is a disgrace.
Donald Trump is a better man than I. The best I could have done was simply say, you know what, when folks who are anti-American in their leanings are having a problem and fighting, the best thing for me to do is break out the butter and the popcorn. But he stepped up and, defended Nancy Pelosi. If you remember, he actually said that he would call in votes from the GOP to help Nancy Pelosi regain the speakership at the beginning of this Congress if she had any problems with her caucus. That is the level of regard, for whatever reason, Donald Trump has for Nancy Pelosi. She doesn't have the same regard, at least she doesn't express that in any way privately or publicly. But Donald Trump also took aim at three of the four witches on Twitter, as he is wont to do. And of course, now you get you've had the responses to this that are he's terrible and he's racist. But let's read exactly what he tweeted. He tweeted this. Both of these, I think, were on Sunday, the 14th. So interesting to see progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally come from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe. The worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, if they even have a functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came, then come back and show us how? Well, show us how it is done. These places need your help badly, you can't leave fast enough, I'm sure that Nancy Pelosi would be very happy to quickly work out free travel arrangements. That's what he said. There's no mention of race. Oh, but it's implied. No, you just want to read it there. Now, we do know where these women are from. Ilhan Omar is from Somalia. I believe Rashida Tlaib is from Palestine or some other country in the Middle East. And the places from which they come, Somalia is, as Dick Durbin would say, a fecal void. And Palestine, being next to Israel, which is a well-run state, is a place where people go to die. Anyone from those places wanting to try to tell the United States how to govern anything needs to shut that foolishness up, or however else you want to put together the acronym STFU. And Donald Trump, without using that acronym, is telling these women just that. Do you think the American people have a problem with that? Heck to the no, no, no. Because that's exactly how the American people feel. The American people who come from everywhere to join in this great experiment started by a bunch of English colonists, primarily 243 years ago, we're like, we never said we are perfect. We just work hard to be better than everybody out there, and we've proven that we are. Now, for all you who want to criticize us, there are about 193 other countries where you can take your sorry behind and do whatever you want. If you don't like it here, get hacked. So what did Donald Trump say? Y'all came from some jacked up places, and you're going to come here, which is not a jacked up place. At least not compared to these places you come from, and try to tell us what to do. Oh, come on now. We're not trying to hear that. Now, the interesting thing to me is how unintelligent and deceitful these women are. And I mean that sincerely. On the 12th of July, which was a Friday, 3 of the 4 witches, Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley, actually, instead of appearing as part of a committee, they testified before a committee in Congress about the conditions they found for migrant women at the border. Remember, it's always about women and women of color, as though there's nobody else in the world. Interesting. Here is a part of their testimony.
Members. And at that point, we asked to enter one of the cells. We were allowed to speak to the women, and these are the women that we spoke to. It's their handwriting. And while we are being asked to speak only to officers, we are not getting the accounts of migrants, of their treatment, of what they are experiencing. And so when these women tell me that they were put into a cell and that their sink was not working, and we tested the sink ourselves, and the sink was not working, and they were told to drink out of a toilet bowl, I believed them. I believed these women. I believed the canker sores that I saw in their mouths because they were only allowed to be fed unnutritious food. I believed them when they said they were sleeping on concrete floors for 2 months. I believed them. And what was worse about this, Mr. Chairman, was the fact that there were American flags hanging all over these facilities, that children being separated from their parents in front of an American flag, that women were being called these names under an American flag. We cannot allow for this.
You have to bring people in the room who can't be here. So I'm asking for Jacqueline, who's was age 7, from Guatemala, who died from sepsis while in our care. She was the same age as my son when I heard about it. Mr. Speaker, we do have a crisis at our border. It is one of morality. As we have seen this current strategy unfold, intentional and cruelly created by the Trump administration, dead set on sending a hate-filled message that those seeking refuge are not welcome in America. I ask you and beg you not to look away.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot unsee what I've seen.
I cannot unfeel what I experienced. I refuse to. Although admittedly it robs me of sleep and peace of mind, but that pales in comparison to the pain felt by families that have been robbed of their liberty, their legal rights, and their dignity, and some even the lives of their babies.
So let's deal with this emotional idiocy one at a time, because you heard in order AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley. Canker sores because of food. Really? And unnutritious food. She would have you believe that all these migrant women showed up at the U.S. border as healthy as can be when there is report after report of all the different diseases, some of which don't even show up that much in the United States, if at all, that they bring with them. They had to drink from a toilet. Have you seen the design of the toilets at the detention centers? In the top half, they put a drinking fountain. In the bottom half, of course, you have the toilet bowl and you have reservoir above. Perhaps she didn't know that when you fill a toilet bowl, you're using the exact same water that would run through any other faucet in any house. They're not drinking toilet water. Be serious. The one that really irritates me, because Rashida Tlaib is just not even worth discussion, to be honest with you, but Ayanna Pressley and her foolishness is, you want to talk about all the issues for the children of migrants. Look here, so-called black woman. You who have the highest rate of abortion in the United States. You who have the highest rate of divorce, of illegitimacy in the United States, the highest incidence of sexually transmitted diseases. Instead of worrying about migrant women at some border 2,000 miles from your district, why don't you worry about the issues that black folks have? And you worried about people who've been losing their children? Blacks are the most murdered individuals in this country. Why are you worried about folks at the border when there are people dying who are black in Massachusetts? Who exactly do you represent? This is foolishness. And now these witches have ganged up and turned on Pelosi. Trump is hitting them. Go ahead and get up out of here and go do something productive in a country that needs you, because we don't. And they're turning on Pelosi. And they're making the Democrat House caucus ungovernable. Understand that. The Democrats are now on their heels, not because of anything the Republicans are doing, but because of those they welcomed into their caucus. It is rich. It is wonderful. And the one thing it is going to do is alienate the Democrat Party even further from the American mainstream, to the point where if they don't find a way to expunge these people, eject them from the party, they may never, ever be able to exercise power at the national level again. They've already lost the Senate. It's hard to believe that they're going to keep the House with the inactivity and the discord that they're running in that body through their caucus. Very difficult to believe that they can. I'm going to enjoy this. And I'm going to enjoy Donald Trump acting on behalf of the American people, talking to them just like middle America would. You don't like it here? Get hat. Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin'. We'll be back right after this.
I have a dream. One day, this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Black Man Thinkin'.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
Black Man Thinkin'.
Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Black Man Thinkin'.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Black Man Thinkin.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Black Man Thinkin.
Stanley Levy, Black Man Thinkin, here on the vanguard of personal freedom, personal liberty, and personal responsibility, Mojo 50 Radio. Also WDDQ, Talk 92.1 FM in Valdosta, Georgia, WJHC, Talk 107.5 North Florida Talk Radio, FreedomInAmericaRadio.com, and WLBB News Talk, AM 1330 and FM 106.3 in Carrollton, Georgia. Final segment of the show. Why does the reparations nonsense continue? That's just an open question. You have to understand how far back this goes. In modern times, relatively modern times, you can trace this back to 1989 when John Conyers started consistently introducing what was known as H.R. 40, what is known as H.R. 40, into Congress at the beginning of every session. And it was named 40 because of the 40 acres and a mule that was associated with the General Sherman Order, Special Field Order 15, that gave blacks or freed slaves land and a pack animal, which, I'm sorry, the general never had the authority to do. It was rescinded. Congress never followed up with any other legislation for a very simple reason. There is such thing as the Constitution. And if the country was going to come back together, these people had to be treated as you would treat them under the Constitution, because the U.S. prosecuted the Civil War under the idea that the secession was illegal. If the secession was illegal, then they still considered the Southerners as citizens. Citizens cannot be deprived of property without due process of law. It's in the Bill of Rights, guys. Can't take it. Really? So that never went through. Well, black people, I said, I'm sorry, slaves were not considered citizens. Slaves were never considered citizens. Had they been considered citizens, you would have had to count them fully when determining the number of seats that a state would have in the House of Representatives. Instead of counting them as 3/5, you would have to count them as one full person, which would have meant more states or more representation for the southern states by another 2/3. They would have had 2/3 more seats in the House of Representatives than they had when the Constitution was ratified. Had the southern states or the Confederate states been entitled to another 2/3 more seats in the House of Representatives, how do you think that would have worked out for black people who still weren't going to be allowed to vote? You would have been counted as a full citizen. You wouldn't have been allowed to vote. And all the people who were profiting from your position as chattel were not going to reward you for what your presence gave them by freeing you or educating you or doing anything else for you. How do you think that would have worked out for black folk? Would there have been a civil war even? Or would there simply have been an avalanche? Would it have split the nation is a better question. and split the nation in such a way that the southern states, the Confederate states, had so much legislative power that they weren't even the ones who seceded, but the North would have seceded, and the South would have just let them go and kept their peculiar institution. Nobody asked these questions. There was a reason. But you can go all the way back to Special Order 15, which is in the 1860s. It was during the Civil War. It was out there, didn't last. You went through Reconstruction, never saw fit to do that. And it's not as though blacks did not achieve or receive land after the Civil War. They did. It wasn't given to them or taken from one and given to the other. They worked for it. They bought it. They acquired it. Now, subsequent generations of blacks gave it away, unfortunately, in many cases, not all. But what you want to do is say, we need reparations now. Okay, well, let's get this straight. In 1989, John Conyers made it his life mission before he was Me Too'd out of Congress to always keep H.R. 40 up there. That was his thing. You gonna tell him we need our 40 acres? You ain't gonna get it. And in John Conyers' mind, H.R. 40 was not actually about getting payment. He spoke at Brown University in 2013 as part of a lecture series, it seems, talking about what his goals were with regard to H.R. 40.
Now, when I introduced the legislation in 1989, it was the first time we'd ever asked the federal government to do something about it, the legislature. And that is to create a commission of persons who have a background and experience in this subject matter, who could help us work our way out of the past enslavement and how we would reconcile that awful period of our existence when it was legalized enslavement, and what we might do about it, and whether there should be an apology, or could there be, or should there be an apology, and what form our reparations would take. Now, it's important to know that this is not a bill on how we deal with reparations. This is a bill that calls for a commission that sets up a study of reparations, in which we intend to have the first hearings, not only in Washington, in which we build up the first set of federal discussions about reparations out of the Congress, and then tour the country and have citizens who may not have any particular expertise, but have a strong opinion about the subject, and we would like them to be heard as well. And then this would all be put together in a form of volumes and turned back to the Congress for its disposition. It would be the first official inquiry into this subject that has ever happened in the country. Out of that introduction of legislation, a whole new interest in the subject, I'm happy to say, it was developed. And many people are working on it. Many people are not waiting for the study, but they're engaged in the study themselves. It's very important that we realize, as many scholars and independent writers and on many campuses know, that we don't need to wait for a congressional study that seems to be very difficult to get off the ground and out of Congress.
So John Conyers wasn't really trying to accomplish much. I just want to have everybody talk about it. Okay. What was that going to do? Well, the whole idea, of course, was to build consensus so they could eventually go for the check. If you have enough people talking about it, and if we can get more studies and more people and build momentum, then we can finally go in and demand our money. That's what that was about. That's why he went back every Congress, beginning in '89. For every Congress that he was there, he would introduce that bill. And Democrats, when they were less anti-American, simply had the political sense to recognize, man, ain't nobody trying to hear all that. There's no sense talking about that. All you can do is tick people off. They're not trying to hear all that. But now, of course, you have the anti-American Democratic Party. So, of course, we're going to have a discussion about reparations. It is anti-American. It goes along with what the Democrats are. Because it is anti-American to go back and say we need to punish those who committed no wrong to make up for the injuries of those who suffered no injury. You want me to give, let me say it this way. How do I punish the uninvolved for the injury you never received? Let's make sure we understand something. The majority of people in the United States never owned slaves. 6% of the country, black and white, and others owned slaves. The 1830 census, for example, reported that there were 3,748 black slave owners. So I wonder whether or not their descendants, once you traced them out, would be eligible for, I don't know, I don't care. Now, once John Conyers got himself released from Congress because of his Me Too activities, wrong side of Me Too, a worse individual, Sheila Jackson Lee, picked up the mantle. Sheila Jackson Lee has an interesting habit of sounding like a rational person until you ask her a question of importance or get her out of her depth. Here she is in March of this year on a Sirius radio program called Make It Plain, talking about how she had picked up the mantle of H.R. 40 and they were going to move it forward.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, you have reintroduced the Conyers bill, H.R. 40, correct?
I am very grateful that Congressman Conyers thought I would be the member of Congress to bring this bill back again for reintroduction, which was done in last Congress and this Congress. But it ties into the climate that we're in, which is at least a rising increase of racial incidences. I don't judge whether someone is a saint or sinner, but I do make the point that it is appropriate to assess the economic and long-range contributions of African Americans or Africans who came here first in 1619. This is the year of the return. And it is juxtaposed against the increasing voter suppression that draws us to also introduce or restore the vote to protect, if you will, Section 5, or to restore Section 5. You know, we should not be ashamed of the fact that America needs to be fine-tuned every couple of decades or every couple of years. And it gives me a degree of sadness for people not to understand that the Congress has to fix things, and we need to fix and cure voter suppression through the restoration of the Voting Rights Act and the protection of the Section 5, again, restoring it, but also in this climate when when so many incidences are happening, but also the economic impasse that is happening with the economy and education and healthcare as it impacts minority communities, particularly African Americans. The Reparations Commission is an appropriate vehicle to assess this, and I'm very grateful that a number of presidential candidates have said that they support the study, and that's what we want America to understand. It is a study. Being here in Selma, I wanted to be recommitted and inspired as I walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to say that we must do this.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson, thank you. Thank you for being in Selma as always.
Thank you.
So Sheila Jackson Lee continues the idea that we're just doing a study. Now, let's not get it twisted. Tahina, whatever his name, Mr. Coates, I can't figure out his name. I don't really care enough to figure out his name. He wrote an article in The Atlantic. I tried to read it. I can't remember if I finished it because it was disgusting to me. And it was called The Case for Reparations. He made no case for reparations. He made a great indictment of dead people. That's about it. There was redlining in Chicago, and people who came up from Mississippi were not allowed or weren't in a position to buy houses in the same way that whites were. They were taken advantage of. The laws were against them, and nobody came to help them. And I'm sorry, that was back in the 1930s and 40s. That was 70 and 80 years ago. Those people are dead. Well, the people who benefited, I'm sorry, the people who were benefited were not the age of consent and had nothing to do with any crime that was committed. You can't do this. And the only way you can think about doing this and give any thought to this is if you're an anti-American. Because only someone who is against America and against America's ideals would seek to punish the uninvolved to ease the pain of the uninjured. So I say this, and I want people to understand, to all the white progressives and their pets of color who keep hyperventilating about slavery, reparations, and African descendants of slavery, ADOS, got to have an acronym, got to have a hashtag. You can't have a legitimate social justice movement without a hashtag. So this was a hashtag ADOS. I have to ask him this question. Because you heard Sheila Jackson Lee talking about when blacks came here in 1619, there was no America. There was no United States of America in 1619. How are you going to hold America accountable for something that was occurring 157 years before she came into existence? If you want to take that up with Great Britain or England, feel free. England still has a king, queen, or excuse me, a monarch. It's a queen now. If you want to bring your case to them, good luck. What they will tell you is that we lost jurisdiction over you when the war was concluded in 1783. We don't have anything for you. Then what you can do then is go back to the American government, and here's one thing that always gets me angry when I think about it. Black people aren't entitled to anything for slavery. Not after the nation paid in blood. You want, after the United States fought its bloodiest war, highest number of casualties on to date, I believe, is still the Civil War. To address the issue of chattel slavery, after they paid in blood on fields throughout the territories east of the Mississippi, and then once you got south as far west as Texas, blood's not enough for you. Well, we shed our blood. You didn't shed your blood to get free. Somebody else did that for you. You know what that sounds like? I know someone else who shed blood for someone else to be free. We won't go there, will we? I won't. But it's true. How much are you going to charge the one who hung on a cross and shed his blood for you for whatever it is you think you're entitled to that he's not responsible for? Nevertheless, I just have to ask this question because I wonder sometimes. So for all you white progressives, all you black Democrats who keep going on and on about reparations for slavery and talking about, well, the Japanese the Japanese had something done to them by the American government. Slavery was not something the American government, the federal government, either condoned or condemned. They took a neutral position. They were not involved. It was a state issue. That's why you had some issues with some states with slaves and others without. But now you're trying to make it a federal issue when it never was. That's a ridiculous thing to do. But remember this. Here's what you want people to believe. That a nation that had slavery for only the first 87 of its 243 years, 243 and counting. Slavery was done after 87 years. A nation that ended the institution of slavery by blood and then by amending state and the federal constitutions. There was never a need to amend. The 13th Amendment was never needed. By the time the 13th Amendment came along, you didn't have any place where slavery was legal in the country. It was specifically illegal pretty much throughout the entire country. Still, you had that. There, again, no more than 6% of the population, both white and blacks, owned slaves. Period. So what are you going to do with the 94% of people who didn't own slaves? You're going to charge them too? Well, they profited. No, get out of here. You wouldn't take that. That's like saying because you lived in the neighborhood of the drug lord in Compton, then when they come for him, they ought to hit you up too, because you were around. And he spent money in the neighborhood, and if you had a store, you got some of that money, so we got to get you. Do you know that 40% of the U.S. population traces their origin in this country, or their entry into this country, back to Ellis Island? Ellis Island opened in the 1890s. Civil War had been over for almost 3 decades. 40% of the nation is going to look at you with respect to reparations and say, I ain't got nothing to do with that. And of the ones that are left, only 6% ever had a connection to slave ownership. Who are you saying is responsible for this payment? You're not the Japanese. You were not you were not singled out by the federal government, rounded up, stripped of your goods and your freedoms, and taken away. Well, they took our freedom. No, you never had any freedoms in the United States of America. The Japanese did. And those freedoms were violated by the federal government. You didn't have them. You were granted them after the Civil War. You did not have them beforehand. But you think you're going to get money out of people. How felony stupid can you be? Let me make it clear. America is not perfect. America will never be perfect. America is better now than it was 2 years ago. Now that the Islamist bathhouse queen is out of the Oval Office, America is a better place economically. Oh, we're more divided. No. Let me make this perfectly clear. America is not more divided. Progressives are more exposed. The silent majority, the same people that elected Richard Nixon, that elected Ronald Reagan after him, that elected the Bushes and elected Clinton, they're still silent. They don't say it. They don't have that much to say. And they still are the silent majority of Americans. The division comes because those who are anti-American in their stance are more vocal, and they receive more coverage from the American media and press. America is better. Look at the economy. Look at the job situation. Look at the wealth that's being generated for people, and not just the, you got tax cuts for the rich. Man, stop telling that lie. If you knew anything about economics, you would not tell that lie. And I'm getting ready to wrap up the show. But what we really need to understand about reparations, number one, the black folks today, slavery's got as much to do with you as the man in the moon. If you're failing today, slavery has nothing to do with it. White people, I say this with all sincerity, if you go for this okie doke, you don't deserve a nation. And I say that and I hold you responsible because you're 65% of the nation. If you go for this okie doke, it doesn't matter what anybody else does. You need to stand up and say, I didn't do it, I'm not paying for it. Which is the same thing any American should do. That's it. And this nonsense continues for the same reason today that Booker T. Washington gave back more than 100 years ago. There is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public, having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles. They have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. The Democrats are also throwing black folks a bone, so they won't pay as much attention to the fact that they're being thrown under the bus for the Latino community. But that's a different story. That's our show. May God bless you. May God keep you. And we hope to see you next week if he says the same. In the meantime, do take care.